Welcome back, gentle listeners, to Philosophy for the People. We are here with the great professor, once again, Dr. Jim Madden, and we're going to hit an important subject today, I think from a very interesting angle. We're going to revisit the problem of evil. And on my Substack recently, I commented on Mark Johnston's very provocative and creative defense, which was brought to my attention by the good professor here. And I was saying, Jim, when you're up at my house, and again, I must apologize that Jim was at my house recently and we failed to do a live stream. Talk about the problem of
It,
of
it's
failure, right?
because we were partying too hard. There was just
Oh,
there's no
dude,
time.
I still
Right.
have the bags under my eyes.
Yeah.
Um, and I was telling you, man, we both obviously read a lot in the areas that interest us. But it's like every once in a while, you still hit an article that just like really grips you in a way, right?
Yep.
Like you read a lot of
Yep.
stuff, you're like, okay, there's an interesting point here, there's an interesting point here. And you also read a lot of stuff like this is just total garbage, right? But
Yep.
it's like music, right? Yeah, you hear a lot of stuff, but every once in a while, you come upon a new song that just really grips you.
Yeah.
And this is how I felt about Johnston's response to the strong form problem of evil, which we're going to talk about here. Not because I completely agree with it. In fact, I've got a number of critical points that we'll probably save the assessment for a later episode. We really just want
Yeah.
to use this as a opportunity to summarize what we think is a very creative project, and then also as a maybe broader teaching opportunity to kind of
Yeah.
show everyone what's going on in these types of debates. So that's what
Probably
I have for
kicking
state.
off a series of episodes on the problem of evil,
I
occasioned
think
by
that
these
that
papers. Yeah.
I think that would be super cool. And I
Yeah.
don't know if it's too early to tease it, but me and you are actually
Yeah.
engaging in some of this project on this ourselves. So this is
Yeah.
sort of relevant. Cool, man. All right, give us any stage setting. Maybe you want to introduce people to Mark Johnston himself. Who is he?
Yeah.
What's his background? What's he up to? Yep.
Yeah. As always, I'll begin with crass self-indulgence, right? So,
Please.
the problem of evil for me is, it goes, I mean, it goes deep for everyone, right? But for me, my first real introduction to like serious doctoral level philosophizing was once again with Bill Rowe, right? Who was not my dissertation director, but was on my committee, and I was his TA for a year.
Yeah.
Um,
And for
and so
people who
I've
don't know, this
always,
is kind of like a problem of evil guy, right?
yeah, yeah, and I've always wanted to get back to it. Like, so I early on, one of my first things I published was a paper on Leibniz and the problem of evil, which please don't look that up because it's probably terrible. Anyways,
Dude, I
look
know
at
it's
the,
like it's I hate to say stuff like that because it's true, but I
yeah,
hate to say it because it's going to be true 10 years from now of everything we're doing right now. And that's
I
just
know,
such an
I know,
awful
yeah,
thought. It's just such an awful thought.
yeah.
But
It's
it's
like
true.
I just proofread the new book last week, and it's only been a few months, right? I'm like, why did I say that? And I can't change it now, right?
Dude, like
So
dirty secret, but I don't think it's so much of a secret. Like I've been really hesitant to reread the book that I'm just about to have published. Why?
yeah,
Because like I hate myself,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But a minute, but this is just a problem of just like
yeah,
everybody is so overly and hypercritical of their own work, and that's for a separate conversation. But anyways, continue.
yeah.
Yeah,
But anyway, but then, I wanted to get back to problem of evil for like 20 years, and then finally last year I wrote a paper, published it on problem of evil. That paper actually sat on my hard drive for like 10 years before I published it.
isn't that
and
funny?
and now, you and I both independently have kind of come into this, right, like being interested in this problem again. So we're going to do a couple papers together on it. I'm probably going to do something book length on it that's going to connect it with the scientific philosophy and the scientific image of man stuff that I've done. So
Yeah,
I think problem evil for me is going to be an abiding theme for a couple of years here. So yeah,
yeah,
kind of the
awesome.
next phase for me. Yeah,
So before we get to Johnston's account, and by the way, I'll link his paper. I'm pretty sure it's open
yeah,
access, so anybody can
yeah.
read
It's
the
in
the full
religions.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, so highly encourage
yeah.
you
So
to do
who is
so. We'll
Johnson?
try and summarize it best we can, but it's there's a lot there, so we're not going to be able to hit every point. So please just do the homework and read the
Yeah,
paper. But I thought again this would be a good opportunity to kind of maybe for people who aren't totally familiar. This is philosophy for the people. What's
yeah,
going on with these types of debates? Where is the conversation currently at? Stuff like that. So
yeah,
yeah, problem of evil. I mean, just generally,
yeah,
right? Like, who is it supposed to be a problem for? Well, generally, it's supposed to be a problem for theists, presumably, right? It's one of the most long-standing objections against the existence of God, right? Hey, if God exists and he is the way that traditional theists like to think that he is, namely all powerful and all good, it's the kind of mix of those two attributes, then that doesn't seem to predict a world like ours, namely a world with so much suffering and agony and disorder and all that sort of stuff, right? If God exists and he's perfect, then why don't we have a perfect world? I guess is the most simplistic way to put it. And through a lot of, I guess, the history of philosophy, there was a kind of strong form problem of evil. Many have come to call this the logical problem of evil, where the claim is there's something like strictly incompatible between negative states of affairs and the existence of God. And for people who
Yeah.
are kind of familiar with these debates, they'll realize that the logical kind of problem of evil has largely fallen out of favor, but not entirely, because Johnston's paper itself is
Yeah.
actually a response to James Sturba, who tries a very valiant resuscitation of the stronger form problem
Yeah.
evil. But largely, I think most people would agree that, yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Let me time you out there. So the classical logical problem of evil would basically would say, and this may be straw manning a bit, but like one person, gets a hangnail, ergo God doesn't exist,
Yeah.
right? It's the idea that any negative state of affairs that is in principle preventable should not be happening if God exists, right?
Yeah.
That's straw manning a little bit, a lot of it, right? Okay, but what's interesting, what I find about Sturba's stuff is he's only saying certain horrific evils are logically inconsistent with God's existence. So classically the way this goes is an atheist says, well, if God is perfect, he would want to prevent all negative states of affairs, right? All bad, right? He could prevent them, and he would know about them, right? So nothing would escape, right?
Right.
And then the classical reply is that, yeah, but look, it seems like it's perfectly consistent with moral agency that one allow evils that greater goods may come. So it's pretty easy to beat you on the hangnail thing, right?
Yes. Right.
You know what I mean? But I think what Sturba's done, which is interesting here with the logical problem of evil, is saying that there are some evils, right, that are bad enough and they happen frequently enough that there could be no moral justification for, ergo God doesn't exist. You see what I mean? And I think that's why it came back a little bit.
And he actually sort of uses a Pauline principle to motivate that.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, do no evil that good may come. Right. Yeah.
Right.
So interesting. So right off the bat, I find Sturba, although I think can be addressed, I think is an interesting development on the atheological side of this. Yeah. Anyway.
It's a refinement for sure. It's a refinement. And I'm with you. I think, and by the way, there was I think Johnson's is a collection of it. There was a whole volume put together around Sturba's project. And you not only had responses from Johnston, but Phaser and stuff like that. So I'll encourage people to check that out. I thought it was a very interesting read. Okay. All right. So then, all right, Jim, why don't you just take it from there then and slide us into the evidential problem, right?
So let's say logical problem evil, right? Out, right? Suppose, generally pre-Sturba easily dismissed because there can be moral justifications to allow terrible things.
Right. No, nobody has really been able to draw out this strict incompatibility, right?
Yeah. Then, and you can find this already in David Hume to some extent, but in the late 1970s or 1980s, Bill Rowe comes along and says, okay, let's take a deer dying in a forest fire where no one is there to witness it, leaving aside tree falls in the woods worries, okay, right? Assuming nature is constant and all that. So it's not like the deer gets anything out of that painful death. It's not like you and I witness it and thereby, become all the more virtuous to save the animals, right? Okay. It seems highly unlikely that deer's death makes any contribution to any further good that God might have in creation, right?
Right.
And so, of course, is it possible? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. Right. Could we tell a logically possible, metaphysically possible story wherein that deer's death would indeed make this contribution? Yes. But Rowe's point is, how likely is that?
Right. Yeah.
And prima facie, it is hard to say that it's at all likely that if that deer didn't die that horrible death, the world would come apart. Right.
Right. So the idea is that that deer's death, right, we don't see, at least immediately, any reason why that death could be prevented without losing something better or landing up with something worse, for
Yes.
example.
Yes.
Right. Hmm.
And and Roe uses the animal case. He uses a real case of a I don't want to repeat it, but
Sue,
like
the case of Sue. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, a young child who was like brutally murdered and violated. I think it was on Christmas Eve or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and once again, like Roe will ask you, and he's right to ask you this. Okay, so really, did you need that in order so you could be free or creation could be ordered or something like that? Like, couldn't we have gotten a by without that case? Right? How
Hmm.
likely is that? Right? And Roe will say, he's not proving anything. It's not a demonstration. He just thinks the probabilities come out such that it's much more likely that God is not here, right?
Hmm.
Or isn't tricompetent than it is that he is here or is tricompetent.
Hmm.
Given that you have cases like that seem very unlikely to make any real contribution to our standing as free agents or whatever your preferred theodicy is, right?
Right. Right. Hmm.
And so then the dialectic continues from there, where, for a lot of people try to come up with, accounts of what God would be doing or would want that like are highly probable if God exists, wherein that would be necessary. But I think really all those kind of attempts to answer Roe on the plane of theodicy or defense, my view is they basically fail, right? Because it's very hard when Roe says, yeah, but why that one? Why would that
Right.
one have to
Hmm.
be there, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, so then along comes a guy named Stephen Weikstra, a longtime friend of Bill Rose, right? Who comes up with the notion of skeptical theism, right? And Wykstra's position is that, look, if God exists, then we would expect that God would know of goods that we don't know about and would know about connections between evil states of affairs. This is important. Would know about connections between evil states of affairs and goods that we don't know about, right? If
Yep.
you admit that would be something entailed by theism, right? That God would know of goods that we don't know about and know how they're connected to evil states of affairs that we don't know about, then it would seem the Roe case, Roe is basically saying it doesn't appear as if God is here, right?
Right.
Given these cases. Weich's reply is, okay, if indeed we don't know what God knows, how would you expect things to appear differently if God did exist,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
So basically, like Roe's making a kind of a falsifiable empirical claim, right?
Right.
And and um, Wykstra's calling him out on, saying, "Look, okay, then how would it look if God exists?" You say, "Well, that kid wouldn't die, or that deer wouldn't die." Wykstra say, "Well, only if you know what God knows, only if you know what goods God would know about and how they're connected to evil states of affairs." So what Wykstra's saying, what the skeptical theist is saying, is
Yeah.
if you throw God in the mix, we don't have enough information to make an assessment of the probabilities.
Right. We're not in a good enough epistemic position
Yeah,
to make those judgments with
yeah,
any sort of confidence, right? Another example, kind of, and I don't know if he technically classifies himself as a skeptical theist, but he makes similar points. Would be Alston, right? He'll say, look,
yeah,
the move from I don't see a reason for this to probably there is no reason is clearly unjustified in this context. It'd be like
yeah,
if I'm a neophyte at chess and Jim's a master, just because I don't see what Jim's reason for that move was, I'm in no reason justified for thinking that there is no reason. In fact, if I already know that Jim is a chess master and I'm a neophyte, then I should be confident there is a reason and that I wouldn't expect to see it, right? And then just switch
yeah,
the relevant things around for our inherent cognitive limitations and what God would
yeah,
know and the connections
yeah,
God would know if God exists. And I think you
exactly.
can see this type of point pretty quickly, right? Hmm.
Now, it's interesting that for Weichster, basically saying, my understanding of it, right, is if God exists, that then becomes like an undercutting defeater for our ability to make assessments of what ultimate goods are and how they're connected to states of affairs in the world, right?
And that, of course, if people aren't familiar, that's one of the biggest. In fact, that's an objection I have to certain
Yeah,
forms of skeptical
yeah,
theism is that it casts such a fog on us that we
yeah,
essentially lose all expectations of God, and I think that's totally wrong, actually.
yeah.
Um, right,
This is Brian Davis's objection to skeptical theism. He's saying, look, man, if I am more certain that it's wrong to like torture kids under all circumstances, right? Whatever good comes from it. He's like, I'm more certain of that than I am of any thesis you could advance about like what the possibilities are for God's knowledge. Do you see that?
Yep.
And so like Brian Davis, a theist, a Thomist, like actually rejects skeptical theism for that very reason. He thinks it what you're introducing is a very acerbic moral skepticism into the mix here that he won't buy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And
Right.
as I think many, right, I think at most Thomas should have what I would call a sort of restrained or modest skeptical theism
Yeah.
concerning like tokens, right? But maybe not types, for example.
Right. Right.
Um, but we're not here to give a response, our response to this issue.
No, no.
We're
This,
really here
we're
just
laying
to
up
kind
the
of
pornography.
set the stage and then get to Johnston's account. So yeah, please ignore
Yeah.
all that for now. You've heard Jim and I talk about this.
Okay,
before,
so
like,
then basically, I think basically the skeptical theism thing takes us to like kind of the debate or the stalemate between skeptical theists and their critics is kind of close to the state of the art, right?
yes, right.
Right. Okay. So should we maybe like work our way over to Johnston?
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit now. Maybe
Yep.
I think one more thing that might be helpful
Yep.
to differentiate would be the difference between a theodicy and a defense,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So I'll give my broad understanding, Jim, and then you can refine it around the edges or just totally disagree if you think I'm
Yep.
off base, right? But when we talk about a theodicy, we're talking about really a narrative that wraps around some particular data, and often we think it's some stubborn data like suffering and evil, right?
Right.
That actually is a probable consequence of classical theism, and we think it describes the actual world, right? So theodicies are like pretty bold and muscular, right?
Yeah.
And they often be pretty
I call them
detailed.
robust.
They're robust, they're muscular, right? They lift weights. Theodicies lift weights.
You're
They're
making
really
a
trying to
claim.
make it advance. That's kind of why I like them, to be honest. A defense is much, much more modest, right? A defense is really just trying to block an attack at the very least. And it's saying, here's some possible world. I don't know if it's the actual world, but it's a scenario that at least bears enough relevant characteristics to this actual world that we can give you an illustration, no matter whether it actually describes the actual world or not, that shows you that this data isn't so stubborn at all. It can be harmonized with a theistic picture, right? And that, of course, is an exceedingly modest claim. It does not claim to prove that this is the way the world actually is. It's just really taking the force away from the atheological
Yep.
attack, right? Yeah.
Agreed.
I don't know if you want to
Agreed.
add anything else to that. Mm-hmm.
So the way I would put it is a theodicy is making, and I 100% agree with everything you say, is a theodicy is saying, we know of a good that we think God would pursue, and that good is sufficient to justify a certain case of a negative state of affairs, right?
Yeah.
So it's to say, and once again, like the way I like to put it is, we claim to know this good, and we claim to understand its connection between what we think God's ends in creation would be and the states of affairs in the world, right? So it's a very bold claim, right? There's a lot of information packed into that. Okay.
Yep. And naturally, those are more difficult to advance, theodicies.
They're more difficult to advance. And in the evidential game, right, the Bayesian game, right, we're claiming, given our background knowledge of the world, it is probable God would be doing this, right? And it's probable that his doing this is connected to these evil states of affairs, right?
Right on.
And there the dance begins. Okay, now,
yes,
what a defense is saying, it's much weaker. And this is exactly what you said. Is the way I like to put it is, it's not saying it's likely God would do this, and it's likely connected to these goods. It's saying, for all we know, we can't rule it out that God would do this, and for all we know, we can't rule it out that it's connected to these goods.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you go defense, there's a lot less you have to defend, right?
Yeah.
But that's going to be very, very unlikely to be effective in an evidential worry, right?
Yes, right. Yeah, like, so where is the defense useful, in the wider situation? It might be useful, like, if you already think you have really good reasons to believe in God or classical theism, and like the strong form probability of evil is really the only thing you see as a threat, then the defense is all you need, really, right? But if you think maybe that we're kind of at an evidential stalemate, concerning naturalism and classical theism, right? Then you might want a little bit more than a defense, for example. So it
Yep.
really kind of
Yep.
depends on what your actual kind of overall position is on this
Right.
perspective. One more thing I want to say is
And can I
like,
say real quick? Real
yeah,
quick
yeah,
though,
go, you go first.
I
Yeah.
don't think there's like a hard line between a defense and a theodicy.
Yeah, I was actually going to get into that a bit. Yeah.
But if I give you a defense and you're like, well, Jim, how likely is that? And then I start motivating it. Okay, what am I doing?
Right.
I'm
You're starting to
theodicizing.
do a theodicy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I was going to say. Really, so like for a theodicy, we say we kind of want probability, right? But for a defense, we say all we want is plausibility. But hey,
Yeah.
brother, plausibility is sort of in the eye of the beholder, right?
Yeah, and plausibility is a species of probability, right?
Right. And like as soon as you start to like make a case of why you think things are plausible, you're probably going to start making a case for why things are probable to an
Yeah.
extent, right?
Yeah.
But to show that it isn't maybe that messy, like I think I can give a pretty quick defense that I don't think is probable at all from my background knowledge that I
Yeah.
think actually kind of works as a defense, but might be highly plausible or probable for someone else. So I mean, here's a quick one. People can laugh and sneer at this. I don't think it's true. Jim, I think I teased this for you when you're at a house, right?
Mhm.
Just imagine that like something like a extreme, platonic notion of the soul is true, and there's pre-existent souls that exist with God and in perfect bliss, right? But they want to go on adventures, and so they engage in some sort of pre-contractual agreement
Yeah.
to enter into determinate worlds that they are co-creators of, that are filled with real indeterminacy, so they can go on, these kind of various crafting and building adventures. But at the end of the day, universalism is true, and there was a prior contract of consent to whatever goes on in these worlds. Now,
Yeah.
you might think, "Whoa, that's freaking wild," right?
Yeah.
But there's kind of assumptions there that many people would find highly plausible. Moral assumptions about consent, philosophical, anthropological assumptions about the human soul, right? I don't buy that
Yeah.
stuff. But if somebody did find those assumptions plausible, they could probably run a defense in that direction, right?
I can't rule it out. I can, right.
Right.
As in something that you and I are working on that I wrote up yesterday, I put is like theodicies are evidentially expensive, whereas defenses come cheaply.
It's so cheap. Yeah. Very,
So
very
cheap,
cheap. Right.
right? So cheap.
And
Right.
so I just give that as an example to show that, like, I think I could, like, if, push come to shove, like, actually give a defense along those lines that I would find personally totally unbelievable. Right.
Yeah.
But it could still succeed
Yeah.
as
And I
the
think that's
project it's supposed to do.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Mhm.
I think that's an important thing as we understand Johnston's paper, because
Yeah.
he calls it a theodicy, but I think what's going on here is much more like a defense, right?
Sure.
Is like,
Yeah. Mhm.
because once again, because all you need to reply to a logical problem, a logical atheological argument is a defense, right? And it, as long as it can't be ruled out, it's logically possible. It sort of fits somewhat with expectations on basic theism. Done, got it, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. All right. So let's turn to Johnston now. And again,
Yep.
I don't want to make his whole project essentially a cartoon right from the beginning. But if I were to summarize this whole
Yeah.
thing, he's essentially, and it's called the primordial free will defense.
Yeah.
More or less, Johnston is dealing with one of the more difficult aspects of the problem of evil and suffering, which is natural evil, by pushing it all down to the realm of moral evil of archons, which is to say angels and demons, right?
Yep. Yep.
So if you can understand that general strategy, you're going to have a roadmap for the details that we're going to get into. The one thing I'll say about whether this is a defense or theodicy is I don't know Dr. Johnston personally. He seems like a very fascinating thinker to me. But I like, and Jim, I know maybe you've had some acquaintance with him, but maybe he does really think this is true, because he does spend a lot of time seeming to argue that this kind of flows. Like, if you have certain plausible metaphysical commitments in classical theism, this is actually the sort of result we should expect, right? So I'd actually just be curious, like, do you think this is the actual world, or are you just merely playing the mere defense game? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had the absolute honor of sharing the stage with Mark Johnston for Thomistic Institute. It was a co-sponsor event between Thomistic Institute and another institute. I think it was Witherspoon at Princeton back in 2019, right? And I have to say, Mark Johnston is one of the absolutely most fascinating people I've met in my entire life. Right, interesting guy.
Jim's met a lot of hip cats, right?
I've met some hip cats, but Johnston is he's top 3, right? Okay, And Johnston is an Australian by birth. I think he studied at Jesuit schools there, then comes to the United States for graduate work, writes under Kripke at Princeton and stays at Princeton his whole career. He's been at Princeton his whole career, right? That's an achievement. Basically, the way I think about hylomorphism is deeply influenced by Johnston's work on material composition. I've got a paper coming out on that, right? He wrote two interesting books in philosophy of religion, philosophy of mindish stuff, Surviving Death and Saving God, right? Which are absolutely fascinating. I think they're this, although he, in some of the footnotes in this, he points that he's moved off of some things he did in Saving God. So his position is in motion, right?
Yes. Yeah. And what struck me is he really has seemed to move from a panentheistic conception of God to a quite strong, what I would consider like a Thomistic classical theism.
Yeah.
In his paper.
Or like very, very Platonic, right?
Yes.
Or Neoplatonic, right? I think in the footnote he says is like the view expressed in Saving God would need to be adjusted or something like that. It's like it's it's typical academic weaselly a little bit, right? But okay, we do that, right? But anyway, so I think in this paper, okay, so how did evil come into the world? A primordial free will theodicy. I actually had seen a draft something like this that he gave me after we met or before we met, but I think we've got to like I want to just make sure we're like contextualizing in fairness to Johnston what he's actually up to here.
Of course, yeah. And again, let me insist that people actually read the paper, right?
So Johnston, if you look at all his work going back to like the early 2000s when he's doing Surviving Death and Saving God, those two books, right? And then if you see some other lectures he's done in the intervening time, and now what's come out here, and there's going to be, I think, book length stuff coming out from him now, right? Because this is like, I think, a piece of the Gifford lectures and stuff like that he's been giving, right?
Yeah.
But he is very worried about human life becoming what he calls odious. Okay. And he's very, very impressed by some arguments that you can find in Kant's second critique, and you can find in Kant's religion within reason, within the bounds of reason alone.
Yeah.
Okay. He actually says in Saving God, he accuses the new atheist types, right, of amateurish undergraduate philosophy of religion who have ignored the graduate course, which what he identifies in that book with Spinoza and Kant, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much he's moved off of that, okay? Because like what he's worried about is if indeed he thinks unless there is an absolutely objective morality, right, and we are somehow assured that we can satisfy the demanding conditions of that absolutely objective morality, our lives are rendered like meaningless.
Okay? Yeah, extremely Kantian, right?
Yeah, straight out of the second critique. Okay, and like this becomes Kant's argument for the existence of God and an afterlife in the second critique.
Yeah.
Okay, and Johnston goes right with that, different methodology, but the same general structure of reasoning, right? In Saving God and Surviving Death, like there needs to be, there has to be an objective morality, or else we're rendered odious. Therefore, there is one, right? He just thinks it's more plausible to go that route. That only makes sense if there's some sense of survival and there's some sense in which our doing the right thing makes some kind of ultimate difference, right?
Yes.
And I think we're evolving in Johnston to sort of less naturalistic ways of thinking about that. Okay. Now, so if you look at, if you don't mind, if I go to the paper here, because for me, this was the really interesting part of it, right? So I'm on the first page of the paper. So he begins by saying, Sturba isn't interested in evidentialism. He says he goes all the way. He's like, I'm demonstrating that God doesn't exist. Okay. And he says, I'm just going to quote Johnston here. That is important if true, as argued in why did the one not remain within itself? An earlier paper of his, which is a very interesting paper. If there is a defensible non-zero credence associated with the existence of God, understood as absolute, that is, unsurpassable and undiminishable, goodness then, the goodness, then the expected utility of any one of our acts, that is the chance weighted measure of that act contributing to the goodness of a total reality impersonally considered, is the same as the expected utility of any other, namely zero. Okay. Then he says consequentialism and even the consideration of consequences, when understood just in terms of potential impact and available acts and personal goodness, then provides no rational ground for action. Okay, so first thing Johnston's saying is, if the Neoplatonic God exists, utilitarianism and consequentialism are out the window.
Yes, right.
Okay, so I think what he's saying is, if that God exists, then whatever we're supposed to be doing is something more like conformity to a moral absolute and not consequentialism.
Yeah.
Okay, now, what Johnston's arguing overall is to say, if there's a moral, like there has to be a moral absolute or our life is odious. Okay. And there, that entails theism. Do you see where, like, then why Sturba gets his ire, right? Because
sure,
Sturba was trying to demonstrate against theism, right? Okay, so what does Johnston need to show here? He needs to show that there is a non-zero probability that the Neoplatonic God exists. And if that's the case, then consequentialism is out. The only way our lives won't be odious is if there's a moral absolute, which then will entail theism for him.
Yes, sure, right.
In an afterlife. That makes sense. Okay. So all he needs to do in this paper, right, is to show that there's a non-zero chance that the Neoplatonic God exists.
Right? Yeah, which is not the most difficult project that one can set themselves up for, right? Yeah.
I've been less than clear, but I think this is fascinating what he's up to there, right? Is like,
yeah,
if Sturba's right, there is no God, and then therefore Johnston would say our lives are odious. All right.
Yeah.
Because Sturba claims to show there's a zero chance that God exists, right?
Yeah.
Johnston just needs to show there's a non-zero chance that God exists. Therefore, utilitarianism is out. We have moral intuition, so the only way we can satisfy those is Kantian morality. Ergo, theism is true, and we have some kind of afterlife.
Right? Yeah. Right. Good. Sorry. Okay, so that's really helpful with the much wider context.
Yeah.
For people who aren't familiar with
that answers a question that you said earlier. Is does Johnston really think that this story that he's going to tell about the Archon is true? I don't know, but I don't think it matters to him necessarily, or it doesn't matter for this project. He just needs it to be non-negligibly probable on the assumption of God's existence.
Yeah. Good. Okay, so let's that's great. That's great, Professor. So let's get into some of the sort of, I guess, details, at least general highlights. Again, we're not going to be able to cover the entire thing, and I even did write up my own summary on Substack if people want a summary of the summary. But let's begin with a few things that Johnston uses sort of either as initial assumptions or motivations. And some of these we can just list, which Johnston himself defends if you want the further defense of it. Others we can maybe give a highlight of Johnston's defense itself. One, of course, is that if you're committed to this Neoplatonic conception of God, he thinks that sort of comes with, and I think he's right about this, something like the principle of self-diffusiveness, right?
Yeah.
And he thinks that, and this is kind of an interesting thing, he thinks that when you're looking at the data of contingency, he deploys what he calls the principle of adequate reason. And he thinks like, hey, theism, and he's not running like a traditional metaphysical proof here. He's just saying, hey, if we just like think of like what's the best explanation of contingency, the theist has a pretty good story in conjunction with a restricted form of PSR, right? And that's simply this. So like God could have stayed within himself, or God could have created, and he had reasons for doing both, right? One set of reasons for creating is to diffuse of his goodness and, ultimately work to unite creation to himself. There's a lot of good there. One reason to withhold is the problem we're dealing with, the risk of significant, often horrendous evils, right? Which God would at least know is possible, if not even probable, right? And so Johnston argues that like neither of these collection of reasons are decisive or compelling in and of themselves. Right. And so it's in that space of reasons where you have, two options that are non-determining, if you will, that the power of the will of God's actual freedom comes in, and that's what grounds the
Yep.
contingency of the world. I
Yep.
thought that was just kind of like a neat way of kind of getting at a traditional
I thought it
insight.
was the best way. I honestly, the best way I've seen that ever spelled out.
Mhm.
I
Especially in
think. I think it's
like the 2 paragraphs he does it is like, yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
it's it's like pretty standard fare if we're you know what I mean? But I think it was the
Mhm.
best presentation I've seen, right? I love that notion
Yeah.
of principle of adequate reason.
The principle of adequate reason, and it not only grounds contingency, but Johnson will argue it grounds more than that, stability and order with certain qualifications, which you can get into right now. So Johnson also says, well, look, if God decides to create, which he was free to, refrain from doing, then we can expect certain things, right? And this is where Johnson gets into the principle of diffusiveness and the hierarchy of being, again, very traditional Neoplatonic
Yeah.
principles. Essentially, that if God is going to create, we can expect a chain of being, right? And the
Yeah.
first, well, actually, no, he doesn't even go that far. Sorry, let me take that
Doesn't go
back.
that far.
He,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I think this is one of the coolest moments in the paper. Is he's saying,
right,
look,
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry,
yeah,
erase what I just said because that's not
yeah,
technically right. Yeah, sorry, Jim, clean it
yeah.
up. Yeah,
Because he wants to say, man, the chain of being thing is not God's business.
humans
Right.
are not God's initial plan. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, mhm.
Yeah. Or yeah. So he says, what would God do? He would directly create the most perfected non him thing he could
The
create.
thing that is as close to him as he possibly can get.
Yeah.
Right.
And then that would be his ends in creation at that point have been met. Right.
Yes.
So he creates, archon intelligences, right? Okay.
Mhm.
He creates them.
Entirely spiritual
Yeah.
entities as close to God as can
Yeah.
possibly be for any
And
created
this
being,
like
right?
hits my like my you know anti-humanism pleasure bone when Johnston says this. He says,
Well, yeah, he's just like,
yeah,
stop thinking the world's all about you humans,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, he says like the slightest inspection of the way the world actually runs will show you that we are not the point of this damn thing, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
I love it, right?
Which,
He's like,
by the way, I fundamentally disagree with, and so does a lot of the tradition.
yeah,
But I'll save that reservation for another
yeah.
time because,
I know.
yeah.
Whereas I'm like, yeah, that's right, man, right? You know what I mean? And so he
Actually, let
says
me.
like, we're not,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah. Finish your thought, and then I'll
so,
clarify what I
yeah.
what I mean. Yeah.
So he
So.
says we're not the point of this thing. The
Yeah.
point of this thing
Mhm.
is the archon that God creates directly.
Yeah.
And then at that point, he wants to say that God, but like metaphysically necessarily, must be hands off on what the archon do.
He defends a very strong notion of libertarian freedom. Johnson
Libertarian
does
freedom for the archon, right?
for the Archon.
And
Mhm.
and he actually says like once God makes them, he can't take it back, right?
He must necessarily abjure. Now Johnson
Yeah,
talks about that the space of metaphysical possibility is sort of constricted, but I don't think that's
yeah.
technically the right way of putting it.
I'd
It,
put it
it, it would
differently. Yeah,
rather say there's a set of conditionals that if God does this, then this must follow, right? So God just really
yeah,
fulfilled the conditionals of bringing about beings with libertarian freedom that entails just certain restraints, even on what omnipotence can do, for example.
exactly.
Hmm.
Right. And so God makes the archon, right? In doing that, in order to make them closest to him, he's got to make them free, right? That means he has to abjure from interfering in what they do, right? Else he would not have made them what they are, right?
Yeah, and
And
it's
so he,
important that they are also rationally uncoerced in
yes,
in like the ideal way, which helps to explain this necessary abjuration that Johnson
yeah,
talks about,
and
right?
they're going to get away with it, whatever they do,
Hmm.
right? Right.
Yep. Hmm.
And so then the archon, because they're so basically like self-indulgent and narcissistic, go ahead and make, right? Go ahead
Yeah,
and make
like,
their own creation, which is
right.
the world we have. Yeah.
All right, so get this, ladies and gentlemen, right? Like this is literally the demiurge account, but the
Yes.
demiurge is
It's
literally a
amazing.
demon. The,
Yeah.
the demiurge is literally a demon. And our universe, this is kind of the radical, for many people will be jarring component of Johnson's defense. But remember, it's just a story that he just needs to show,
Just a
like,
story.
for all we
For
know,
all we
right?
know.
Is that this universe is created by a fallen archon, right?
Yeah.
That is, and let me also be clear that Johnson isn't claiming to propose a Christian defense here. This is just
No, he's not.
totally pagan for as
Yeah.
far as we can tell, right? So
Though he does appeal that, like he does point out that there's, some people find arcani kind of stuff in St. Paul. You know what I mean?
well, all right. So let's pause here. I
But
know I didn't want to
yeah,
get too much into assessment, but
yeah,
let's spell out what, and also Johnson also goes in for like incarnation and atonement too. So he does
yeah,
pull in Christian resources.
yeah,
Um, what a difference for the Christian tradition might be, and Jim, we talked about this in private, and my invitation for something for the people to think about is, if you swapped in the traditional Christian accounts, could you hold on to what is most important to Johnson's defense?
yeah,
And those traditional swaps would be essentially this, right? That material creation isn't literally made by an archon, right? But material creation is mediated
yeah,
through
yeah,
spiritual entities in the Christian
yeah,
tradition. Furthermore, that God does aim for human beings, because as spiritual material fusions, we're sort of that microcosm within the macrocosm that God wants to ultimately kind of like, through bringing us into union with himself, God drags the
yeah,
whole thing along. So those would be like, I think, two significant,
yeah.
both personal and Christian departures from it. But other than that, I mean, Christians are like, yeah, archons, totally, right?
Totally.
Where,
Yeah.
there is a
So, so
primordial free will thing that
yep.
Christians I can appeal to here, but
Is
like I said, I
isn't
don't want to
the
get into like the critical assessment,
yeah
or personal assessment too much. Yeah.
isn't the incarnation thing for Johnston? Correct me if I'm wrong with this. Isn't it like, look, God looks down and he sees what the archons are doing, right? And he's
Yeah.
like, look, I'm not going to stop them. I can't stop them on Johnston's
Yep.
account, right?
Yes.
But I can jump in and do the incarnation thing to help out these poor humans who are being victimized by the archon, right?
Yeah. So
It's
here's
kind of, yeah,
here's the other part of Johnson's account, right? So the archons create, not just to express their power and narcissism, but also to invite God to create other embodied wills in that world for the battle of souls. Like literally, it is a cosmic spiritual battle for Johnson.
yeah,
Now Johnson claims that while the archons can, create material cosmos, only God can create wills, right? So he puts, for
yeah,
various reasons, he says that only God can create wills, and there is a lower bound below which God would not accept the invitation from the archons,
yeah,
right? If the world is so terrible, right, that it would just essentially be a permanent hell for any, like, God's not going to put
yeah,
another will in there, right?
right,
So it's got to be the case that God actually thinks that he can save whatever will he
yeah,
embodies in the material world.
yeah,
So like that creates a beacon of hope
yeah,
or optimism in Johnston's
yeah,
account as well, for
exactly.
anybody who might otherwise be freaked out of being in a demonic view. Like God,
And
he thinks that God is constrained, that he will not go below a certain bound in
yeah,
terms of bringing about other wills. Right. Yeah.
and as you read the paper, you might find yourself on like your Bayesian scratch paper, like, okay, you're like, dude, you're like loading up the hypothesis here, man. You're loading it up, right? Okay, so God creates archon,
Right.
probably, hypothesis got stronger, right?
Yeah.
Archon are free, archon, I
Yeah.
mean, and now lower bounds, all that. But here's the deal. I think it's a defense. So
Yes.
load it up as you like, right?
Well, I would say two things. One is that since it's a defense, you can load it up as much as you want and decrease the intrinsic probability. Or, and I think this might be what Johnson would do, is certainly what I do in my forthcoming book, is show that these are not internal complications; they're probable consequences.
Yeah, yeah,
And then you don't have that
yeah,
issue. But since it's a defense, I don't think it matters too
yeah,
much either way, right? If it's
yeah.
a
I
theodicy,
actually, yeah,
you have to take that latter route, right?
yeah,
If it's a defense, it doesn't really matter,
yeah.
right? You can put in as many adjunct hypotheses probably as you want, right?
Yeah, I actually think Johnston might actually say these are entailments of the definition of the Neoplatonic God.
My guess is he would think that this is what
Yeah.
is entailed if God
Yeah.
creates, that this is necessarily the case, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Good. Okay. So like
But
again, like as wild as all this sounds, like you just have to realize that plausibility is in the eye of the beholder, right? So if you already think that you have good reasons, whatever they are, maybe it's just that little consideration from contingency, right?
mhm,
Maybe it's just that, or maybe you have many other reasons to think that God exists, and that these other commitments are not, like super crazy. Maybe they're even probable. Shoot, maybe
yep,
you even think they're entailments. This might not be so wild of a story either all, depending on what, overall, depending on what particular perspective you're coming from. So like,
Yeah.
I would just say, like, if you're already a committed, hardball physicalist naturalist, of course you're going to jeer at something like this, right? But at the same time, I think you'd be missing the greater context of
Yeah.
which a conversation like this is actually playing out in,
I
right?
mean, I think Johnston enjoys the jeer. I think
He
he really does.
seems very playful in this
Yeah.
article. Like, it seems like
Yeah.
he's kind of smirking behind this. Like, he
I think he's
obviously takes this
trolling.
as a serious philosophical issue, but there does seem to be a little high level trolling going on here, right?
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
totally wrong about that. Maybe that's just my own projection of
But
trolling self,
let's
right?
keep it in the context of the overall, let's call it maybe neo-Kantian moral argument that he's trying to run here, right?
Yeah.
Is if indeed you have like apodictic certainty in like a deontological ethic, right? Okay. And you think that entails a certain kind of theism, right? All right. Now, and if the only way you can answer the logical problem to that theism is by drawing out this story, well, guess what? It's a demonstration, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? It's
Let
a
me
demonstration.
so let me also say, also excellent point, Professor, that we are glossing over a huge number of details here, and it would be
Oh
an
yeah, yeah,
enormous disservice just to take what we're saying and not read Johnson's account. Because look, in his account, he argues that any finite creature necessarily can self-valorize, right? Choose
Mhm.
their own perceived welfare, interests, and power over the good as such, right? And that he has his reasons for thinking that God must necessarily abjure if he's going to create these beings of liberty. Like, he defends a lot of stuff that goes into this account, like, quite significantly. So I just want to make it clear that we are really just scratching the surface of
Yes, yeah,
his
totally, totally.
sort of creative exposition here. Um the other thing I wanted, I guess, to well, I guess, I mean, like, what's the immediate, um if not exceedingly obvious, implication of the primordial free will defense? And it's what I said at the beginning of the episode. Is like, anything that you think is sort of wrong or bad or haywire about the natural world, Johnson's story gets God off the hook of directly willing this stuff,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Whether
yep,
that's certain species emerging through certain mutations, tectonic plate shifting, like, whatever, like, the fact that he's got this archon as responsible for this actual material creation, um, is is a really kind of creative, and I think not wildly
yeah,
implausible way to kind of make sense of this. And in fact, it kind of connects with a lot of, like, very traditional dualist insights, Jim. Like, a lot of, like, there, it wasn't unheard of to think, like, hey, the world seems, both beautiful and harmonious, yet also, disordered and chaotic in other ways. Maybe there's just two gods and they're just
yeah,
warring, right?
yeah.
Um,
Or
Johnson's,
go
yeah,
back to our Sellers discussion. Your Sellers says the original image, right, was of a nature that was essentially suffused with intentional action, right?
yeah,
Like the wind was blowing to knock down my house, right? Okay, you know what I mean? It wanted to knock down my house, something like that, right? And in Sellers' views, even the manifest image does not fully overcome that. Like, it still assumes a nature that sort of runs on implicit purpose, if not explicit purpose, right? And so, like, what does like the archon account do? It satisfies this sort of like basic human intuition, right? That nature is not indifferent, right?
yeah,
That nature is intentional somehow, right? It satisfies the great basic pagan intuition, right? And it seems like, like Christianity, and I'm not a historian of Christianity by any stretch, so, but Christianity never said that intuition was wrong, right?
mm-hmm.
Christianity only said, yeah, but there's an overall dude running this thing who creates it
Yes,
in those, you know what I mean? So
yeah,
one thing
yeah,
that's I find
totally,
interesting at like at a wooier level, right, with what Johnson's doing here is to say, on the one hand, the anti-humanism I like, and two, the enchantment I like, right? Meaning, like,
yes, right,
it's letting us keep I mean, like, keep in mind, like Aristotle basically thinks of the planets as like a kind of archon, right?
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they're running things at the levels below them, and the ultimate deity is not really, you know, directly running things here, although through what the archon are doing, right?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
And Johnson just like in a sense even just goes stronger and holds really Johnson is committed to a secondary creation. He calls it a secondary
secondary
creation.
creation,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I find it fascinating to see this kind of affirmation of the basic pagan insight, right?
Yes.
Without being a pagan. I'm not coming out as a pagan or anything like that, right?
Right. Yeah. Let me real quick, let me read actually Johnson's summary. I have the quote pulled and I think
Mhm.
that'll encourage us to kind of comment a little bit further and maybe offer some of our final summary thoughts. So here's
Yeah,
3 paragraphs by Johnson here I think really kind of capture his project. He says, "What I have offered might be termed a primordial free will theodicy." He does use the term theodicy.
yeah,
Creation is God's free, rationally uncoerced self-manifestation, and it has a double aspect. Its first movement is the bringing into being of created wills. Its second is the invitation to them via grace to deploy their libertarian freedom to enter into the joy of God's own inner life. Right. So he does have this, kind of union with the Godhead as the highest good still playing work in his
yeah.
overall project. Right. Johnson continues. He says, an internal necessary condition of the acceptance of that offer is holiness, right? The free, uncoerced subordination of one's good to the good as such. For the two movements to succeed, God must
And that's
knowably abjure. Yeah, go ahead, Jim, if you wanted to chime in. Mhm.
that definition of holiness is straight out of the second critique.
Yeah, uh-huh. And it's I
Sorry.
mean it's grounded deeply into Christian tradition
Yeah,
as well,
yeah,
right? So I think he's all on fine ground there, at least from the perspective I'm coming from. So he continues that God, yes, for those two movements to succeed, God must knowably abjure. Specifically, he must knowably intend to let those archons who choose to valorize their own good over the good have free reign in the use of their creative powers, even up to not interfering in any of their created universes, except by the way of grace's effects on the wills, if any, that God then embodies in those universes. God, consistent with his aim in creating, cannot, in a strong sense, playpen his first creatures. They know that. Though only God can create a will, there is a possibility that a demiurge creates a universe where possible wills that require some embodiment or other could find suitable embodiments. If God then creates and embodies a will in such universe, the goodness of God guarantees that however things go for that will in that embodiment, the concrete offer of grace will continually remain. This aspect of the
yeah.
theodrama of redemption, I believe, is a source of great hope.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah,
and
you
then,
can see, yeah, you can see how it fits. It's all his argument for immortality ultimately as a condition of our being moral beings.
yeah. So let me highlight one more thing that I think is kind of the what he sees as I guess the final nail in the coffin to Sturber's argument, right? And that's the idea of prevention or intervention. Um, so let me just actually read from my summary on my Substack real quick, which will include some quotes from Johnson, because I think this is a point we have to hit. So God's necessary abjuration means God cannot, on Johnson's account, prevent the horrendously evil consequences of creaturely action, though Johnson himself insists that this is not technically a case of God even permitting horrendous evil, at least not in the sense that would leave God morally blameworthy or unjustified. So
Right.
to illustrate, Johnson gives the example of two parents that may reasonably abjure from strict oversight of their 16-year-old child, right? From there, suppose that a child acquires a baseball bat and bashes a schoolmate at school. Now, while an onlooking teacher who could have intervened but failed to intervene might be blameworthy, this is not to say that the parents permitting the bashing are blameworthy, either in a similar sense or at all. Instead, what the parents permitted was the scope of their son's free action, quote, not hemmed in by their oversight. So this is a higher order permission of sorts, and one that does not necessarily by itself render the parents blameworthy in the sense that the teacher might be, unless, of course, and this is what Johnson says, that the parents took an unreasonable risk in relinquishing their oversight, say because they knew that their son had psychopathic tendencies or whatever. However, Johnston explains that in even such an instance as that, the object of appropriate blame is not that they permitted the bashing, but that in abjuring, they wrongly took a significant risk of such things occurring, and taking that risk was the morally indefensible thing. Now, in connection to his theodicy, then, The question is obviously whether God is blameworthy for not playpenning his creatures, which is just to say, for Johnston, creating other beings of libertarian free will in the first place, since Johnston says that that entails that God must abjure. And throughout the article, Johnston maintains, right, that this is a necessary condition of love and holiness and union with God, right? This is all sort of a package deal for
Yeah.
Johnston. And then once all that is appreciated, Johnston takes it that the crucial premise to run an argument like Sturber's would have to be something like, it should not all have been. None of that should have been. Like, considering the scope of significant and especially horrendous evil, no good being would abjure, even if that meant there would be no creation without that being's abjuration. And Johnston just says that that's clearly not the right moral reaction. There's nothing
Yeah.
obviously true about that statement. And for that reason, he thinks that Sturber's argument does not go through.
Yeah. The way I understand, and tell me if I'm reading it right, is I think he forces the dilemma at Sturba. Are you saying it would be better that there be nothing rather than something, if indeed you have to risk getting a universe like this?
If that's
right?
how I read it too, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very least, I don't know how you could give a principled answer to that.
Right. So I think, like, modestly, you can say, like, okay, there's no, like, largely uncontested moral axiom that can easily settle this dispute. But Johnston's actually more forcefully says clearly that's the wrong moral reaction,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think you could just take the more modest one and still run with it, right?
One last thought for me that I have to split, but
yeah, this is great. I think we covered all the things I wanted to cover. Yeah,
I'll get you the papers. I want to follow up on some of the papers of Johnston's that he refers to here, but he says like how it seems like, okay, so in the past, when he's dealt with the immortality that he thinks is necessary condition for our adhering to a deontological morality, a la Kant, right? He's basically surviving death is about, his idea that we only get one embodiment. We have to have an embodiment. And how can we still talk about immortality? And he has an interesting way of doing it. Okay. But in this paper, he makes a reference to another paper where he's actually saying he thinks there's a sense in which we may have multiple embodiments, right?
Yeah, he does hint at that, right, towards the end, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think I've read that paper, so I want to track that down, and maybe we could talk about it on air here. Yeah.
Yeah. So something to think about. Okay, so gentle listeners, let me just reiterate a few things. We are here again merely to present the very general highlights of what we thought was a provocative and interesting paper. This is not to say, I can't speak for you, Jim, but this is not to say that I endorse all of it or even most of it. I just wanted to bring people's attention to it because I think that there's a lot to learn from a study of this. And we thought it would also be a good opportunity not to just talk about interesting things, but also to kind of like, show like kind of what's going on in the problem of evil generally. So go ahead, Jim.
Well, and also it's like the most balls that clink paper in the problem of evil that's happened in a generation, right? I mean,
I love everything about it, man. I like straight up, like, and here's another like example. Like, you don't have to agree with everything that a philosopher does to like just have like great admiration. Like, here's a dude that's just like, we're going full on, we're going full Archon, baby.
No holds barred. Yeah, and but am I committed to the existence of Archon? I don't know. Might it be a safe bet to have a burnt offering later today and pour out a libation? Hey, man.
Easy on offering prayers to Archons, though. I'm pretty sure St. Paul has something to say about that, right?
I'm not going to pray to him, but I'll pour a drip of coffee out.
right. Yeah, but no, I totally agree with that, man. And like, I love stuff like that. I love, and like, look, I can say the same thing about Starbuck. I fundamentally disagree with this project, but there's something like, all right, this dude's like, he's going all the way with it, right?
Yeah.
He's bold. And sometimes being bold can make you look like a fool, but sometimes being bold it makes you, there's something cool about it, right? And there's something that makes it a lot more interesting and provocative and
I picture Sturba as kind of like looking at the evidential atheology is like wishy-washy. Like, dudes, hold my beer. Demonstrate.
It's how many Thomists probably look at like what Swinburne's up to, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you wuss, man. Let me give you a demonstration, right? All right, gentle listeners, we got to split, but here's the deal. Give us your thoughts. What do you like about Sturba's account? What don't you like? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Open conversation in the chat. Of course, this is why we do this thing. We just want to bring things up for your attention and conversation. where whatever you happen to think about it. Hopefully, we provided some good things to think about here, and if nothing else, kind of showed you what's up with the whole problem of evil debate. So, Jim, thank you so much. Anything you want to
Thank
announce
you.
before we say goodbye?
Nope, nothing new immediately. But stay tuned. Things are coming.
Yeah, we'll try and turn if you guys want us to turn this into a series, obviously
Yeah.
your opinion will be considered. So let us know in the
Yeah.
comments. Please like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Peace.